There's a kind of person who says almost every week, I need to get out of here. They say it in the car, in the kitchen, after work, after dinner, late at night. They scroll apartment listings in other cities, watch moving videos, save language apps, imagine a different air. But months pass, sometimes years, and they are still standing in the same grocery line. From the outside, this can look dramatic, flaky, or even a little performative. But often it is not performative at all. It is what the mind starts doing when a person feels deeply unhappy where they are, but cannot leave yet. That gap is harder to live with than people think. Because real suffering creates pressure, and when action is blocked, the mind still has to do something with that pressure. So it creates a story that is easier to carry. This place is dead. This place is beneath me. My real life is somewhere else. The other city, the other country, the imagined future starts glowing with emotional meaning, not because it has been tested, but because it has been recruited. It becomes a psychological exit before it becomes a real one. That is why some people do not just want to leave, they need to believe that leaving would explain everything. You can hear this in the way they talk. The current place becomes flat, stupid, oppressive, provincial, fake, spiritually empty. Meanwhile, the alternative becomes cleaner, freer, warmer, smarter, more alive, more real, almost morally superior. Very often, they are not comparing two places. They are comparing one trapped self with one imagined self, and the imagined self always looks better against the faraway backdrop. This is why ordinary frustration can start turning into total contempt. A bad week at work becomes proof that the whole city is rotten. Social loneliness becomes proof that the culture is cold. Financial stress becomes proof that the country is unlivable. A relationship problem becomes proof that everyone here is emotionally dead. The mind takes pain from one part of life and pours it into geography. Place becomes the container for everything that hurts. That move is not random. It protects a person from a more humiliating thought. Maybe I am stuck. Maybe I am scared. Maybe I do not know how to change my life from the inside, so I keep locating the problem outside. That thought is harder to bear than hating a city, because hating a city still lets you feel directional. It lets you feel that the answer exists. It keeps helplessness from becoming total. In that sense, fantasy is doing emotional labor. It's holding together a person who does not yet know how to move, or cannot move safely. This is why people can get almost possessive about their dissatisfaction. If you question it, they don't hear curiosity. They hear you threatening the one explanation that has been keeping them organized. That is also why practical suggestions sometimes do almost nothing. Save more money, make a plan, apply for jobs. If the fantasy is functioning like emotional life support, practical advice can feel strangely insulting, because the issue is not only logistics. The issue is that the dream has become a shelter for injured hope, and shelters are hard to disturb. You see this especially in people who stay in a suspended state for years. They do not fully commit to where they are because they think they are leaving. But they don't leave, so their real life starts happening in half measures. They don't make the apartment feel like home. They don't invest in friendships deeply. They don't build routines that assume they are staying. Sometimes they even avoid joy, because joy would feel like surrender. If they start enjoying the current place, then what was all that misery for? So the dissatisfaction has to stay ideologically pure. It becomes part pain, part identity, part protest against a life that feels misfitted. This is where people from the outside often misread the whole pattern. They think the person is just romantic, restless, spoiled, hard to please. Sometimes that is partly true, but often the deeper pattern is that the person cannot tolerate being both wounded and immobile. So the psyche creates movement in symbolic form. It leaves mentally before the body can leave materially. That symbolic leaving can show up in small ways. A person stops learning the names of streets. They stop caring about local rituals. They stop decorating their room. They talk about their own life like it's temporary, even when it has lasted 5 years. They say, when I finally get out, as if the current self is only an interim version. Sometimes they become experts in other places they have never lived. They know the neighborhoods, the cafes, the weather, the rent, the vibe, the subway map, the mood. Knowledge becomes a substitute for arrival. They collect detail the way other people collect evidence. Evidence that another life is waiting. Evidence that this suffering is not final. Evidence that they are not the kind of person who belongs here. And that last part matters more than people think. Sometimes the place itself is not the deepest wound. Sometimes the deepest wound is identification. If I stay here, then maybe this is who I really am. Maybe this is my level. Maybe this is what my life became. Then leaving stops being a preference and starts feeling like self-rescue. Even imagining departure becomes a way to protect dignity. That is why these fantasies can be both sincere and distorted. Sincere because the pain is real. Distorted because the fantasy starts absorbing meanings that no city can actually carry. No place can fix shame by itself. No skyline can repair a stalled identity. No passport stamp can turn confusion into coherence. But the mind still tries, because trying symbolically feels better than sitting in pure stuckness. None of this means the person is wrong to want to leave. Sometimes the place really is bad for them. Sometimes the environment is deadening, limiting, lonely, humiliating, or genuinely misaligned. Sometimes people do need a different place. But the psychological pattern begins when the alternative becomes emotionally perfect precisely because it is not yet real. Distance protects fantasy from friction. You cannot be disappointed by a life you have not entered. That is why elsewhere can stay clean in the mind. It hasn't had the chance to become ordinary. It hasn't had the chance to fail you on a Tuesday. And ordinary failure is what makes real places real. The fantasy survives by being untested. The current place suffers by being lived in. So one gets idealized and the other gets blamed for carrying reality. After a while, the person is no longer only trying to escape a location. They're trying to escape the version of themselves that formed there. The streets, the buildings, the routines, the familiar faces start feeling like witnesses. They hold too much continuity. They remind the person how long they have been the same. That is why departure fantasies can feel almost holy. They promise not just movement, but rupture. Not just a new view, but a new meaning. And that promise can become stronger the less active the person feels in the present. When real agency is low, symbolic agency becomes precious. So the dream gets polished, the current place gets condemned, and the mind keeps itself alive by dividing the world into here, which is dead, and there, which is waiting. But eventually, that division becomes painful too, because life keeps happening in the place that has been mentally rejected. Birthdays happen there. Illness happens there. Friendships, breakups, groceries, laundry, morning light, boredom, bills, all of it happens there. And if you keep treating your own life like a waiting room, you eventually start feeling ghost-like inside it. That may be the quiet cost people miss. Not just hating where you are, but becoming absent from your own days. The dream of leaving can protect the person for a while, but it can also split their life into two unreal halves. The place they live in but refuse emotionally, and the place they worship but do not inhabit. At that point, the problem is no longer only where they are. It's the growing gap between lived reality and psychological location. They are physically here and emotionally elsewhere. And the person cannot feel fully real for long under that kind of internal exile. That is why this pattern feels heavier than simple wanderlust. Wanderlust is curiosity. This is often pain trying to become directional. It's distress turning itself into a map. A map can be useful, but it can also become a refuge from the harder truth that no move feels clean when the self is carrying unfinished life. Sometimes what looks like hatred for a place is grief for the self that kept surviving there. Sometimes what sounds like wanderlust is a person trying not to drown in stillness. And sometimes the dream of elsewhere is not about adventure at all. It's what hope looks like when action still feels impossible.